I'd just like to welcome everybody tonight to the ISCAST and New Zealand Christians in Science fourth conversation. I'm Sarah Wilson, I'm the Program Director for ISCAST. And I'd also like to just acknowledge the Reverend Dr. Chris Mulheron, who's the Executive Director of ISCAST. And of course, Nicola Hoggard-Cregan, who is the Co-Director of New Zealand Christians in Science. And we've collaborated to bring these evening presentations and discussions to you until December. Nicola, I'll hand over to you in a moment. She'll be introducing our speaker and facilitating the discussion. It would be great if you're enjoying these Thursday meetings that you would spread the word. And of course, as Christians, we're very good at spreading the word, or we should be. So please do that. And we'd also like to hear from you, any feedback. Even if it's critical feedback, we'd like to know. So please be frank with us. And of course, as Chris said, while we're listening to our speaker, if you could be on mute, and if you have a question, type it into the chat. And Nicola, when it's your turn, we'll call upon you to unmute and ask your question. So before I hand over to Nicola, let's just begin by opening in prayer. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks that we're here today for the blessings that we've had within this day. And we thank you for the gift of science and of technology and for the way it has enabled us to gather here tonight. And we just really pray that you would be with our speaker, Sean. We give you thanks for his wisdom and his knowledge. And we ask you that he would have a really clear mind, that his thoughts would be clear, and that our hearts would be open to the things that he has to say to us tonight. We pray that we really learn some things tonight, and that these things don't trouble or confuse us, but that they would strengthen our faith that we have in your Saviour, Jesus Christ. We pray these things in your name. Amen. Nicola.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome to everybody from New Zealand Christians in Science as well. Welcome to the fourth of our conversation series, which is a bright spot in our lockdown gloom. Our lecturer tonight, however, is free in Wellington and brings a new perspective, which comes from a mix of physics, economics, and management. So Sean, after obtaining a PhD in physics at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch and 3 years overseas, spent 25 years as a government research scientist. And after studying economics in the 1980s, he moved into science management. Following his role as executive director of the Association of the Crown Research Institutes, Sean joined Victoria University as a research fellow and taught strategy for a number of years. Recently, he has taken a systems approach to seeing an economy as a far from equilibrium physical system sustained by energy. He says he's not quite retired, having had a book published by IOP in 2020, which is On with the Reformation, Facing Up to the Church's Misuse of Power. So Sean, we look forward to hearing from you tonight.
Hello there. As Nicola said, I started off as a physicist. I joined the dark side of the force, as I said, in the 1980s when I studied economics, and then have moved over more to the humanities and management. And I've come across the postmodernist worldview. And the one thing I understood is that we all see things differently, economists, humanities, and scientists. And in a sense, this is what I want to discuss tonight and try and find a way of looking at things together. So I'll just try the share screen and carry on from there. So the title is Narrative, Science and Faith. Is there an inevitable conflict between these? The difference between the science and the humanities. The science student and the humanities student were returning to the car after a typical student drunken party. One dropped the keys when opening the door. The humanities student fumbled around in the dark trying to find the keys, while the science students went over to the lamppost to look under the light. "Why are you looking for the keys under the lamppost?" asked the humanities student, to which the science student replied, "I cannot see anything where you're looking. Science restricts issues. It's amenable to rational thought, evidence, and consistency. Science speaks mind to mind. It's often reductionist. It works from the bottom up and seeks to understand the whole by understanding the part. But over the years, it's becoming more holistic, and we now have envelopes for the bottom-up approach, conservation laws, and the treatment of complex systems. Outside the light, in the illustration, narrative guides us. And the major societal issues we face are outside the light of science. So we use holistic or plausible narratives to try and make sense, to guide us. Narratives speak from heart to heart, so to speak, whereas science speaks from mind to mind. So narratives are sometimes heart to mind. So a narrative might be a story, might be drama, art, music, poetry. But narratives help us to understand the things that are not amenable to the completely rational approach. And so is love about dopamine, adrenaline giddying us, about brain function, about sex, or is love like a red, red rose? Drink to me only with thine eyes, and I will pledge with mine. Put a kiss within the cup, and I'll not ask for wine. So what is love? What the scientist said, or what the narrative says? All sense-making relies on narratives. Science uses succinct, coded narratives, and it's restricted to where the light shines, so to speak, where we can see well enough to test for consistency. But it's still shaped by underlying worldviews, underlying narratives. Scientists believe the world is consistent, that reality has meaning, and there are disciplined processes of truth-seeking in science. But hidden narratives and assumptions and worldviews are what divides us. And here's a story. A father and his son are involved in a car accident when driving home after a football match. The father is killed, and the son is taken to hospital with serious brain damage. When the son is wheeled into the operating theatre, the neurosurgeon, on seeing the patient, exclaims, "What's happened to my son?" Son killed, the father killed in a motor accident. The neurosurgeon says, "What's happened to my son?" Is this a paradox? I've tried this with about 100 postgraduate students. Most of them weren't particularly stupid, and only 5 of them were able to resolve what looks pretty much like a paradox. And you might need to think over that a bit. And so what I'm saying is that the culture wars that we have today are a clash of underlying narratives, worldviews. And it's the clash of these worldviews is the cause of destructive societal and religious conflict, the clash of the narrative. It's not the apparent narrative, but the worldview beneath it, the assumptions, the values, and so on. And if you've thought about the illustration, the neurosurgeon illustration identifies an unspoken assumption. If you didn't recognize that the neurosurgeon was the boy's mother, you probably didn't think that women would be neurosurgeons. I tried this actually. Various people had various explanations. One of them said, oh, perhaps the culture muddled up brother, father, and so on. Another one said, oh, perhaps the boy's name was my son. Another one said, my husband's a neurosurgeon and they're all men. So our underlying assumption, in a sense, closes the way we think. So the underlying values that underpin the narrative are critical. Sometimes they're a straight line. A business may claim to put customers first when the actions they take show that it is to maximize profits. So narratives, which are underpinning almost all our societal debate, need to integrate and fit the world as it is, but not some feel-good constructs, which are very common. Global warming, for example, requires an integration of narratives on science, politics, and economic well-being. We could solve the global warming problem just by stopping carbon dioxide emissions in about 5 years' time. But the trouble is, a few billion people will die. We cannot do that. The whole thing is a complex integrated system. So to integrate narratives, we must engage with each other. An underlying Christian narrative is to journey together to find what makes sense. So sense-making starts with exposing and testing the underlying narrative to correct blind assumptions. Underlying narratives must fit the world as it is. We must test them. If the social scientist finds the keys in the dark, the narrative fits the world. But looking for the keys is not in itself a virtue. So open narratives enhance engagement by opening the conversation. If I refuse to consider that a woman could be a neurosurgeon, my narrative is closed due to my ignorance, my laziness, my male power, or a belief that women shouldn't do certain jobs. Truth-seeking then must always explore and test the underlying narrative, the worldview. But common underlying narratives are often power-seeking rather than truth-seeking. Some narratives are that of societal tribes, political narratives, identity politics, racism. It's when these avoid challenge that they close the conversation. Underlying narratives are, these underlying values are about seeking to impose rather than engage. So unless we have open narratives, society is doomed. Unless the hidden assumptions and unquestioned narratives exposed, then the Pied Piper narrative will lead us into the dark. The dangerous narrative is the one that becomes truth in itself. Karl Marx correctly diagnosed the exploitation and oppression of the Western world in his day. But the underlying communist narrative was closed. It failed to recognize the corruption of human nature, and the leaders became the new oppressors. So, and again, any underlying narrative that rejects transcendence becomes truth in itself. Richard Dawkins has an underlying narrative that sees the material world as all that there is. And this is the world revealed by science. Therefore, it follows that God cannot exist. If I think that life has no purpose, then I will find no purpose in life. And I just want to discuss for a minute the hidden narrative that led to the global financial crash. Congress asked Alan Greenspan after the crash, and he was the chair of the Federal Reserve in the US. You found your view on the world, and your ideology was not working. And Greenspan said, absolutely, precisely, shocked disbelief. And yet it ought to have been part of the conversation. And this is a copy from a book that was published before the financial crash, and it shows the housing from 1972 onwards up to about 2006. And in 2004 or there, 2003, a bubble starts to appear in housing, and the incomparable real estate housing bubble is there, and something was about to happen. Like Marx, Greenspan failed to allow for greed and tribal blindness. He talked probably to his own tribe, and the full picture was hidden. He believed the market would self-correct. It did actually via the crash, but not the way he wanted. But then replacement narratives may be just as dangerous. The Extinction Rebellion narrative seeks to impose through moral superiority, blame, and a reasonable amount of ignorance. But there are other narratives, and the Jesus narrative is interesting. Jesus used simple narratives, we call them parables. He used these to explore our existence. From a rational point of view, Jesus was probably the worst systematic theologian of all time, but he got his message across. And then God's story itself is the underlying Christian narrative. The incarnation is God journeying with us in Jesus. And in that narrative, we find the purpose of our existence. And the narrative is enacted out in the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And core to that narrative are kingdom values. And it's an open narrative. People can challenge it. It's not a narrative of power, but one of journeying with others. And billions have found it consistent. If the underlying narrative of the worldview is inconsistent, then the narrative is likely to be a lie. And so we hear it. Here we see the picture of various narratives, the sense-making, scientific, rational narrative, other ways of making sense of the world, but the underlying narrative needs to be testable, and then what is unknowable is outside. But an inconsistent worldview will lead to a false narrative. Closed narratives divide us, open narratives guide us. Dominating narratives impose, and by refusing to engage, divide society. I think Brexit was a tragedy, but why did it happen? And I suspect the fault lies with an elite who were out of touch with ordinary people. And so they imposed their superior understandings without engaging with the issues of ordinary folk. Closed narratives, then, are our main threat, not science. And it's not just Marx and Dawkins. Our danger is plausible but deceptive narratives that may be inconsistent with kingdom values. When I was much younger, the free world and the kingdom of God was sort of seen to be the same thing. So America was out freeing the world, and it was thought to be good in itself. Nowadays, it's more socialism and the kingdom of God are the same thing. We have to be very careful that we're not seduced by the current dominating narrative. The faith narrative embraces science and other truth-seeking narratives. Science is becoming more holistic, reflecting life well outside the lamppost, displacing some societal narratives, and it's engaging widely over the pandemic and global warming. But science alone is not sufficient. The faith narrative underpinning the science narrative provides a coherent set of values to inform science, to challenge dominating societal narratives and not be seduced by them. And we need open narratives to be able to cross-fertilize. We cannot survive without rich narratives that talk to each other. Economics is a well-being narrative. Its basis is, you pull out my teeth and I grow tomatoes and I exchange my tomatoes for you doing service for me. We exchange our labor and we're better off. And it's meant to be a win-win narrative. But in economics, too much is based on the idea of equilibrium, where economic forces balance supply and demand, the market clears and so on. And competition is said to be the driver, but it isn't. If you read Adam Smith's Choice, it is that I can choose to go to this baker or that baker, not because the bakers are competing. And the trouble is competition gives power to the advertisers, whereas choice is talking about power to me. So the absence of choice consolidates economic power. A dominant economic myth, such as that of Greenspan, is that everything can be priced by the market. And the narrative on economic growth is weak. And until recently, it's started to widen up with Paul Romer, who got a Nobel Prize in 2018 or thereabout. But real economic growth is technology-based because technology amplifies human labor. Solow, a Nobel Prize winner, showed that 88% of US growth over 40 years was not due to capital and labor, which is what economics said it was due to. The residual he identified as knowledge and skills. Knowledge goods cannot be priced like economics goods. I can exchange a fish with you for carrots, and we agree what price is. But if I teach you to fish, I don't need to get anything for it. It costs me very little. And if you then can catch your own fish, if you teach someone else to fish and they teach someone else, we eventually teach the world to fish and feed the world. And that's where our real growth lies. And again, the economic narrative is short or is weak on resource sustainability. In 1997, a conference where Solow and Stiglitz, both Nobel Prize winners, believed the market would adjust to environmental issues. Stiglitz has since come to see that this won't work for climate change. So I've developed a holistic approach, seeing an economy as a sustained, far from equilibrium system. It is more like an ecology, a highly ordered, complex, from a physics point of view, a low entropy system. It's sustained by energy and must eject disorder as waste. And in doing that, it combats the second law of thermodynamics. The spear, the plough, farming are all technology or knowledge goods. They increase the distance of the economy from equilibrium. But today, carbon dioxide emissions are not being adequately ejected. And so here's a sort of picture, in my view, of the large economy. Energy comes in, and then these might be cities or nations beneath these, or businesses and firms and so on, farmers, and they're all exchanging energy between themselves. And that's what keeps the economy going. So it's like a vast interconnected computer network characterized by the distance from equilibrium, which is the energy in less the waste out. And growth is about increasing energy in and waste out. Now that just is actually what's happening, for good or ill. And it's technology driven. 6 minutes, a woman on a combine harvest today can harvest what 125 men did 150 years ago. So that's technology, amplifying human labor. So the modern economy is consumer-based and energy intensive. Economic growth drives us further from equilibrium, creating resource problems and carbon dioxide problems. We cannot, like the hunter-gatherer of old, move on, because we have to live in the mess we are making. And my view says that GDP is misleading. The increase of housing costs, and rents and so on, increases GDP, but the order of the economy doesn't change. There is no gain. But underneath these, the transcendent-faith narrative is key to narratives talking across. We are open to all truth-seeking narratives. The faith narrative has learned to engage, mainly because we haven't had much choice. But we still need to be forthright in the public square, recognizing that society must journey together. The faith narrative is realistic about human nature and the natural world. We can challenge unrealistic Pied Piper narratives that will lead us into a dark cave. And the faith narrative recognizes that we need a transformation if we're to survive, from a well-being based on things to a well-being based on values. So narratives must engage across the different areas. We need values, truth-seeking the well-being of all. And here we have the values linking the political economic narrative with the faith transcendent narrative with the science environmental narrative. But within each of these, there are the isms, and they're often high on blame. They refuse to engage. It might be the cancel culture, it might be scientism there, and it might be more fundamentalism here. But values are essential to be able to have cross a narrative dialogue. Our science values ought to be based on improving well-being, not science for science's sake. We need to establish common values and principles, and we need to have values that are outcome-focused, not power-focused. And I want to sort of close by mentioning Mark Carney, who was the governor of the Reserve Bank of Canada and the UK, and he was there in the global financial crash. He's now the UN Special Envoy on Climate Change, and he's the advisor to the current or the upcoming climate change conference. And Carney, by the way, the REIT lectures, he gave them in 2020. You should look at them or listen to them. There's 4 of them. And in the REIT lectures, he was talking about the global financial crash. And then the Minister of Finance from the UK came in and he said, Mark, let me tell them a story. He said, on a Monday morning, and I don't know quite what date, 2007 or thereabouts, he said, I got a ring from the chairman of the 5th largest bank in the world. And he said, we're going under. And the minister said, how long have we got? And he said, 3 o'clock this afternoon. So Carney uses these to say that we need to build values into our economic system. And he's got a book on values and the REIT lectures, and particularly the REIT lectures on climate change. That's the last one. And he points out there that no matter what we do, we will not get to net zero by 2050. We can only get about 60% of the way there by management. We have to have innovation, new ways of doing things, new energy sources, and so on. And he said, what we need to do is have a value system in the economy which encourages innovation. And he was saying you can do that by having an overarching value system which puts priorities on what we should do. And he challenges the cost-benefit analysis, which is common in economics, and says it only works in a limited area. When you're talking about big things like the cost of the pandemic, the cost of global warming and so on, cost-benefit analysis are worth nothing. So we need truth-seeking narratives to provide a wider view of the world as it is. The faith narrative engages across the narrative divide because it has learned to engage. And it provides a realistic perspective on current issues, pandemics, climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic technology. And we can ask questions like, should we have space tourism? I think we can't possibly with our current global warming problems. The key is to recognize that closed narratives will try and seduce us, and we need open narratives as Christians to engage with the rest of the world. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that whirlwind tour, Sean. I suspect that we would like to have a lecture on each of your slides. I find economics very puzzling sometimes, and very, but it's obviously very important. I'm just wondering, while everybody else is writing down their questions, do we need to keep as much energy in the system as we have now? Because, I mean, you know, the climate change narrative is often, well, you know, we've all got to stop doing what we're doing. We've got to use less and use less energy. But will that even work if the whole system really depends upon all this energy going in to keep it?
Well, yes, I would say it's a far from equilibrium system. Now, much of the stuff we may not need, and that can reduce the energy. But energy is critical, and we can't get rid of it completely. Food requires energy to process food. Transport requires energy. And sitting in the mall, I thought, I wonder what happens if we didn't have all the stuff. All the people that are selling all these clothes and things in the mall won't have jobs unless they all become for second-hand clothes and so on. So energy, the things we want, we think we need, we want, require energy. Everything seems to require energy. So it's not straightforward to have use far less energy. Mind you, Britain does much, or Europe rather, does much better than the US. So there's clearly gains that can be made. And you wouldn't say that the European standard of living is severely poor relative to those in the US. So there's hope.
Well, they do better than us, don't they?
Sorry?
They do better than us, don't they, as well?
The Brits, we have a lot more renewable energy. Sorry, and Europe tends not to have as much, but Norway has. So there's a bit of luck in all this.
Okay, well, looks as though questions are starting to come through. John Newton, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, it's not a huge question, but you're near the end of your talk, Sean, which was a great talk, by the way. Really enjoyed it. You made a kind of throwaway comment about space tourism. Should we?
Yes.
Tourism. You argued we shouldn't. But I wonder whether that's a closed narrative thinking, because, you know, once technology is invented, it's very hard to not use it. It becomes unstoppable, doesn't it?
Well, yes. The trouble is we keep seeing Richard Branson and this and that. In other words, at one part of our life, the media is telling us we can do all these things. And another lot, they're telling us sea levels are rising. And we need to have that discussion. That's really the point. Now, it could be, well, I don't know enough about it, but we need, and Carney would say you need to set your priorities. We need to spend more on perhaps thorium energy or some of these things than we should on space travel. In other words, we need to divert our resources to make progress.
Who is we, though?
Yes. Well, it's not me personally. I think what we can do, we need to transform. That's Christians need to have a more simple way of living. If we can transform the way we live, we can perhaps help others to do so. But I wouldn't have thought that I have Well, it changed a little bit, but not particularly much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Catherine, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Nicola. And thank you, Sean. I agree with what Nicola said about your presentation, that we need a presentation, a lecture on each of your slides. Anyway, my question is, you mentioned the central importance of values. In the Christian faith, relationship is of central importance. So I wonder where you would put relationship in your scheme.
Well, we need to talk to each other, and we need to dialogue, which means that we need to know people. We need to break out of our tribes, and so relationships, in a sense, is being open to relationships with people who are from different tribes, different backgrounds. In other words, economists shouldn't only talk to economists, they should talk to people who actually, by their sweat, create the things that we want. If they decided to stop doing it, we'd all go rather hungry. But relationships are critical. That, of course, is where the Christian has a particular understanding, because for a Christian, the whole concept of our worldview, the kingdom values, are those of relationships rather than power relationships.
Okay, thank you. Now, Mark Ridgway, can you give your question, please?
Sure. Okay, the European philosopher Zizek, you may have familiar with him. Very popular. Zizek.
No,
the European
philosopher.
So. Okay, he has the concept of the master signifier, or the political. I think it's sometimes called the political signifier. I think sometimes, and it's the idea that people words develop in such a way that their meaning is simply to create division. And that's their only purpose. It doesn't communicate any meaning at all, other than to say, I'm on this side and you're on that side. And you have this duality of good and evil. Do you think contemporary science is falling prey to that? I got a few echoes in your talk that you might be suggesting that, and I would agree.
Scientists do have difficulty talking to each other. Physicists, what Rutherford said was physics and stamp collecting. These days, of course, what was stamp collecting then has now become molecular biology, and physics has fallen out of the sun, which may be a good thing. So scientists need to talk to each other, and I got pushed into doing that because of the number of jobs I had. And you begin to respect scientists from other disciplines. But I think division is part of human nature, and that's the really worrying thing. And I think Christians need to be aware of this. Sometimes we're a bit soft. We probably shouldn't call it sin, because that'll worry people. But we should, point out that human nature is selfish, and we need to be transformed to be able to build up relationships with those who are different from us. So there we are.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hang on, just somebody's. Okay, Donald, do you want to ask your question, please? Oh, you have to unmute. Donald, unmute.
Okay, I'm with you now.
Yeah.
My apologies. Yes, just picking up a phrase of Sean's that I think he said about rejecting disorder, and I just thought, I wondered if you could elaborate on what it is or give some examples of what it is to reject disorder. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm thinking it from a scientific point of view of far from equilibrium systems. Order is created by high quality energy entering the system. The grass picks up the sun's energy, and you get an ordered system. An ecology is an ordered system. Everything is interconnected. New Zealand, the wetters and the bugs and the fungi, it's all part of the one thing. But if you turn the sun off in a very short time, the whole thing just becomes utterly disordered, just a pile of rubble and chemicals. So from a science point of view, disorder is what things return to when the energy source turns off. Now, you can think of it also from a Christian point of view. I think that once the Holy Spirit, in a sense, gets turned off, from a spiritual point of view, we start to move into disorder. And I think there's an analogy of our spiritual life there as well, that we do need to be spiritually enlivened to stop ourselves decaying into the disorder or the chaos that would tend to be the biblical word for it.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's great.
Thank you. Gray, you have a question.
Yeah, hi. You've done a great job advocating for open narratives. I was just wondering if a narrative can be too open and too inclusive. In the sense, like as an example, I took part in some student protests that were for free education in South Africa. And when the kind of document of demands was finally handed to the university, it included many things that had nothing to do with free education. And I guess in a way, I felt like by including so many things, the message was actually lost and diluted. And I'm wondering if you have such a kind of far-viewed open narrative, if
yes.
you can.
That reminds me of the Irish joke. The Irishman caught the leprechaun, and the leprechaun showed him the tree under which his treasure was. And he said, look, I'll put a yellow ribbon around this. So when I come back, you'll promise not to remove the ribbon or the treasure. I'll come back with the spade. And so when he came back, all the trees had yellow ribbons around them, so he couldn't find the right one. I think that's the problem. When I use narrative that way, what I really mean is that we need to be able to talk to each other. We need to know each other well enough that we could share. And if we share, I don't think we'll get too complicated in the first instance, but we'll be forced to try and see the world from each other's perspective. So I would see it as a behavioural thing rather than a, something concrete.
Thanks.
Okay, Stephen, your question, please. Stephen Beaucret.
Hi, Sean.
Hi.
I've just got a question about, you're talking about these open narratives and the public square. And it seems to me that in our society, the public square is shrinking because of the decline of news media and the echo chamber of social media and money politics and all of these sort of things. I just wondered, do you have any thoughts on how do we enlarge the public square and to have more beneficial discussions about these open narratives?
Well, I think you're right. The public square is now dominated by the media, tend to be monopoly companies and so on, and Facebook, Twitter, and they are there to make money. And there's no reason to believe they're actually there to do society any good. If so, it will be by accident. I'm being a bit blunt. So there is a serious problem, and I don't know. I think we're now moving through a change, and we have to learn how to live with it. We might be forced to go back to holding meetings in parks or something. Not that people will particularly want to listen to us, but somehow or other, the whole public square, as you say, is shrinking. So I've no solutions. If we're aware of it, that may be the first step.
Yeah.
Certainly those of us in science and theology find the public square is shrinking. It's hard to get these disciplines into dialogue with each other.
Yes.
Thanks.
And with the humanities as well, though, I think, theology and the humanities are hard to put into dialogue as well, especially in secular universities. Okay, Matthew McTeague.
Okay, hi, am I ready to ask my question?
You did?
Oh no, am I ready to?
Yes, you're ready to give your question.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
you seem to have two, in fact, yes.
I have one, but I hit enter by accident, so I did the second one and just
Okay.
keep
Yeah.
Hi Sean. My question was, could we see the controversy as being based on this false belief that science itself is a narrative or a meta-narrative or a worldview, which is kind of, could be kind of a false position to take on this. And I'd like to offer an alternative view that science is not a meta-narrative. It's just a study of the behavior of nature. That when it comes to saying what nature actually is or what the person is, it's kind of a feat in that regard. And that's kind of an overreach, the methodology of science. In my question here, I'm referring to the work of Peter Harrison. He's a University of Queensland scholar. He's got some great works which show just how pivotal the Christian meta-narrative was to the intelligibility of science in sort of formative days. So I guess my question is it more accurate to situate science in a wider narrative, and modernity is wrong to suggest that science is anything beyond a systemized means of studying pattern structure within nature insofar as it's mathematizable?
Right. Well, the trouble with meta-narrative, in a sense, I'm talking about a meta-narrative, which is that we should dialogue with each other, and each of these ways of making sense are valid, providing we question the underlying narrative, and that's the nearest to a meta-narrative that I think we've got. Science is very effective, but once it becomes a truth in itself, it can impose all sorts of things, and so it's very dangerous. So I guess the nearest to a meta-narrative is to have a narrative that questions the underlying assumption. And sometimes science's assumptions are invalid. It might be, well, I think Gödel's theorem says some things are unknowable, and science may believe that everything is knowable, and maybe that's just not true. Or if it is, we can't know it.
Okay, can I offer like a quick rejoinder or a quick addition?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I can, yeah. So what are your thoughts on sort of scientific anti-realism and instrumentalist views, which sort of show that the history of science has been kind of a graveyard of non-existent entities like, phlogiston, the luminiferous ether, the four biles, etc. Do you think a case can be made that science just isn't in the business of saying what's there, but it's just more like a just a means of studying structure and pattern within nature?
Yeah. Is there something actually there, or is it just a series of rules to chart our way through? I think, never mind. I'm more of a realist and think that there is something there, but who knows? Not everyone does. And I was just going to quote, and his name escapes me, our famous cosmologist. In his book, what is the Grand Design or something, he basically believes that science is a set of rules, and he basically says if you have two theories and both of them explain all that there is, they're both true.
Yeah.
And so for him, it seems to be a series of rules rather than understanding what's going on. But I think we're lucky that much of what we do does seem to work, but that's probably a matter of luck, or maybe it's a matter of gifting. Einstein said about the universe, the most surprising thing about the universe is that we can understand it. I think he should have changed that. He should have said, I can understand it. But nevertheless, that's a great surprise that the human mind, even one human mind, can grasp something that is as complex. It's like, a little wee bit of a computer understanding the little bit of software in a computer, understanding the whole software of the computer. And that's a strange thing. The universe has to be structured if that is to be so. I think there's a purpose in that.
Okay, thank you. Chris White.
Thank you, Sean, for a fascinating talk. It all went far too quickly for my simple mind, I'm afraid. I'm more interested in economics as a social science and its relation with theology. Economists and theologians have a very poor record of productive dialogue. It goes as far as using the same terms to mean different ideas. And you mentioned competition, which is an example in point. Theologians tend to see it as rivalry along with lots of other social scientists, whereas economists tend to see it as a vehicle for the efficient allocation of scarce resources via specialisation, and indeed actual facilitator of cooperation, which is a kind of challenging idea for lots of others. So how do we get these sorts of groups to open their limited narratives and talk to one another in a productive way? I'm a member of a group that meets in Canberra fairly regularly, and it's got economists and theologians who are interested in these questions. And we spend a couple of days together every year or so and try and really wrestle with these social ethical issues.
Yes. There's no doubt that modern economy, despite the faults I've had with it, equilibrium and all that, is the most effective way we've ever had of allocating resources. And it sure beats war. So, and you say, competition. But actually, modern businesses, a guy called, never mind. He did a paper on the difference between Singapore and Pakistan, the difference in their economy. And he said the thing about Singapore is the economy is a vast network going through other nations, rather like a computer network. And they've all learned to cooperate. It isn't competition. In fact, they all enhance each other. Whereas Pakistan is focused on what you call non-technological goods. And so an economy is a mixture of competition and cooperation. And the Japanese economy, Japanese all work together when they're engaging with the rest of the world, but within themselves, they tend to compete. They're quite happy, but together they'll line up against the rest of the world. They won't let someone come in and sort of divide one of their businesses from the others. So it's a mixed thing. It must be fun discussing what you're discussing. The trouble is with Christian, it must be good for Christians to do this because there's a lot of, there's terrible things going on in powerful economic systems and so on. It isn't as bad as many people think. I would say that of all the billions of people who've ever lived, might be 20 billion, I would be the kind of lifestyle I would have would be a minuscule fraction of the total of humanity that's ever existed. I'm probably 1 in 10 to the 6th or 1 in 10 to the 7th of all of humanity. We're very fortunate, whatever. And every now and then I have a spasm of guilt, but never mind.
It's a feature of the period in which you've lived, Sean.
Yes, it's
luck of where you were born.
It's not due to anything I've got. I'm just lucky. And an Iraqi said to me, he said, "Why was I born in Iraq?" And,
good question.
And he had an unanswerable question.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Richard, would you like to give your response?
Dawn, a quick one for you. Some time ago, I watched a presentation by Richard Dawkins in which a man in the audience stood up and he said, "I'm 50 years old." He said, "I walk and talk with Jesus every day." Something like that. And he went on about his personal life. And Dawkins said something like, "I'm interested in the truth content of your beliefs, not what makes you feel good." Any thoughts on that?
The thing is, Dawkins has narrowed his worldview that does not take into account anything that is not of the material world. And therefore, anything outside the material world has no truth to it. And so it's his it's his underlying narrative that's the cause of the problem. And so it's very difficult for those two people to engage because they both have perhaps different underlying narratives. If I was talking to Dawkins, and I've actually met him, but I didn't talk about such things. If I was talking, I would the Einstein argument about how come the human mind can understand so much of such a complicated system that must be infinitely greater than literature. How come music is so critical? How come all these underlying questions, they're there, and we as Christians make sense of them by saying that there is something outside us going on. Now, Dawkins has closed that option off. And I think the best one can do is to say, look, you've got to keep that option open, and then we can engage.
Perhaps we're using the word truth in different ways then. He has a limited view of what truth is about in the materialistic framework.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, now does anybody else have a question before we finish? Yeah.
I've never submitted a chat question. I'm not quite sure which, having typed it, I'm not quite sure which button to press, but it's a very short question. I could just say it.
No, that's good. You go ahead. Yes.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for a very engaging talk, and I'll be enjoying reading it slowly. So, Sean, I think you said something like that if science gets rid of transcendence, then it becomes truth itself. And do you have a way, you commented on this in your last comment, but I still want to ask you, do you have a way to reinstate transcendence? And if so, is it a form of natural theology?
Well, I think it's the underlying worldview. Unfortunately, we may find that transcendence is the only answer to the chaos that, that as the world gets more and more complicated, as we've got to face greater issues, that without some understanding of transcendence, we will be unable to deal with them. So unfortunately, I think the proof is in the disaster that may be happening, which is a bit terrifying. So we need to keep our view there in the public square to at least stop. We're the prophets, in a sense, trying to warn those who don't have a more transcendent view.
So part of the plausibility is as the pigsty we're in, that we're actually making as prodigals, gets bad enough, it'll become clear that the proposal about transcendence gains more and more credibility as it's able to handle more and more of the disaster we are.
Yes.
That's your line. So
it's a bit worrying, but in a sense, I mean, that's what we need to trust in God for that. I've been brought up, and through most of my life, everything's been getting better, and you begin to think that this is the norm. And I think as Christians, we have to question whether this is the norm, that maybe it's not the norm, and we need to go back to a more faith-based hope for the future. Yes.
So let me just check that. So you wouldn't be aiming to show Richard Dawkins where his mistakes are?
With a dialogue with Dawkins, I would say these are questions that you are, in a sense, suppressing. The various things about the human mind, about appreciating music, so there are questions that he's left out, and as well, it's all purposeless. From a Dawkins point of view, it's all purposeless. And poor Dawkins got cancelled from the American, was it the Atheist Society? He got cancelled because he made some reference about transgender women or something, and they cancelled him, which I thought it was funny, but it's rather sad. And then Steven Pinker sort of decided to side with Dawkins, so he resigned from it.
Right.
So there we are. It's all chaotic if you don't have some underlying cohesive belief.
Yes. Carolyn, can you unmute yourself? You had your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask the reaction to Richard Dawkins. I would like to have had the chance to say, well, what is it that makes you feel good?
Yes.
Can you define what you what makes you feel good in totally materialistic terms, avoiding anything smelling of metaphysics, like happiness or joy or goodness or virtue or love or any of those things that you cannot, that science can't measure.
Yes, I mean, the atheist actually lives as if there is purpose in life, and if there is and as if there is beauty and goodness and something else. So you're absolutely right. That is a question that would be very interesting to hear him respond to.
Yeah.
Yes, he often treats nature as though it's God, really. You know, he's in awe of nature.
Yes.
And you can make an argument about that, I think. Look, we're almost out of time. And so what we will do is we've got one more question from Andrew Saunders, and then he's going to pray to finish us off. But then we sometimes stay online, those of us who want to, and ask a few more questions, if that's all right with you, Sean.
Yes, fine.
Okay. So Andrew, do you want to ask your question, and then you can pray to finish us off? Yeah.
Sure. Hey, Sean, loved the presentation. You said a little bit earlier on that you thought the Marx and Greenspan failed to account for greed and tribal blindness. And you ended up talking about that we cannot, like the hunter-gatherer, move on. Do you think that the hunter-gatherer was faced with the same problems we are, where, you know, we're a top predator out of control, or were they in a more harmony with their environment and the way that most animals and plant species are? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, well, I would think in more harmony, because it's so important. Because of the division of labour in our society, we find people are not talking, and they're probably talking far less now than they were 20 or 30 years ago. And I think this is a problem. And we all live, when I was brought up, everyone was relatively working class. So I came from Blenheim, and there weren't really very many wealthy people. But now all the better off, the better educated all live in some places, and all the poorer educated and the struggling live in others. And we're just not engaging. In the hunter-gatherer society, I think they all were forced to engage. So not sure it answers the question, but that's.
But when do you think that the hunter-gatherers were in that, you know, great swath of time? I mean, were they the ones that God indeed encountered right at the beginning? And in some ways, has his interaction with humanity at the hunter-gatherer stage in some sense corrupted us, so we have become more greedy?
Andrew, I think you might be veering into the topic of another conversation. So can I just say thank you? What was that, Sean?
What was that, Joe?
I was just going to sort of thank you again so much for your talk. I would love to hear a lot more from you, so I hope we do sometime in the future. And it was a great conversation, and you've inspired all these questions, so that's excellent. Andrew, do you want to pray for us before?
I will. I'd love to. Sean, thanks again. Really very stimulating. Heavenly Father, we come before you now, and we thank you that you have given us minds to grapple with science and with humanity, but you have called us to understand your meta-narrative, a narrative in which you are indeed in control of the universe. You're indeed in control of us, and yet you give us free will, perhaps more than the New Zealand government does right now. So Lord, we do thank you for Sean and his great learning and the way he has opened us up today to think. And we all pray, Lord, that we may indeed be more considerate and more kind and less greedy and less troubled by tribal blindness, and indeed talk to people who are not like ourselves. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.